Welcome to the thinking stack. Okay, so cast your mind back maybe 3 months. The internet, well, it kind of went nuts for a bit, didn't it? Colossal Biosciences announced the arrival of the first direwolf pups.
Right. Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. Very evocative names.
Exactly. Straight out of legend and, well, Game of Thrones. They were everywhere. Reuters, social media feeds were buzzing. That hashtag direwolves airback, it actually trended.
It did. And look, the narrative was powerful. Those puppy photos, highly effective, let's be honest.
Totally.
But before we all get swept up in this sort of Ice Age romanticism, we probably need a little dose of reality here.
Okay, bring it on.
These pups, they aren't exactly what you might picture when you hear direwolf. Think more like 99.5% gray wolf, roughly speaking.
99.5%.
Yeah, give or take. And then there's about, say, 0.5% that's been genetically edited. Tweaked to show traits that, well, we think were characteristic of the actual extinct Canis dirus.
Huh. So it's less Jurassic Park Resurrection and more like a genetic remix inspired by the original.
That's a good way to put it. An inspired remix.
Okay, well, that immediately throws up a whole bunch of questions, doesn't it? Like, what's really going on here behind the headlines? What are the potential ripples ecologically, socially?
Yeah.
And maybe even, why are we so fascinated by this specific idea, bringing back extinct creatures or, sort of bringing them back?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to really get our heads around this, we're going to use the integrated thinking stack. It's our framework, really, for systematically taking apart complex topics like this one.
The ITS.
Right. Think of it as a structured way to analyze things. 7 layers, organized into 3 big domains.
7 layers. Okay, walk us through it.
So first up is perception. This is about figuring out what's actually true and what fundamental things we need to consider. That covers layers 1 and 2.
Perception. Got it. Truth and basics.
Then comes prediction. Here, we're looking ahead. What might happen next? How might people react? That's layers 3, 4, and 5.
Okay, consequences and human factors.
And finally, action. This is about, the practical side, assessing risks, planning how to actually do something, or if we should do something. Layers 6 and 7.
Perception, prediction, action. Okay, sounds like a solid way to avoid just jumping on the bandwagon. Let's start with layer 1 then. Cognitive cleanse. What's the real story? Stripped bare. You saw headlines like, CNN's scientists resurrect dire wolf, which, makes you think of huge ancient beasts roaming again.
Right. Instant mental movie.
But is it genuine de-extinction or more, like you said, kind of a Westeros fanfic on 4 legs?
Well, this is where ancient DNA experts like Beth Shapiro really nail it. She emphasizes that de-extinction, quote, can never give you the species you lost. At best, you construct a new organism that resembles it.
Resembles it, that's the key word.
It really is. The media, and maybe our own excitement, tends to blur that line between resemblance and actual resurrection. We see dire wolf and bam, our brain pictures the extinct original.
Okay, so it's a look-alike, a proxy. Colossal calls them functional proxies, right?
That's their term, yes.
But why only a resemblance? Why can't scientists just, piece the original back together perfectly? What's stopping them?
The main barrier is just time and what it does to DNA. DNA is surprisingly fragile over long periods. Studies, like one by Alan Toft and colleagues, estimate its half-life is around 521 years.
Half-life, meaning half of it degrades every 521 years.
Roughly, yeah, under pretty ideal conditions, mind you, like being frozen. After about 1.5 million years, the signal's basically gone. Unreadable noise.
Okay, 1.5 million years is the limit. And direwolves went extinct. When?
Around 13,000 years ago. So technically within that window.
Ah, so there should be some DNA left.
Yes, but here's the catch. After 13,000 years, that remaining DNA is incredibly fragmented.
Yeah.
Shattered, really. Degraded. Imagine trying to reconstruct a whole library from tiny scraps of paper found after a fire.
Right. You've got pieces, but not the whole blueprint. So how did Colossal try to engineer their way around that?
They started with the genome of a close living relative, the modern gray wolf.
Makes sense. Use what you have.
Exactly. They use that gray wolf genome as a sort of template, a scaffold, and then using CRISPR gene editing.
The gene editing tool we hear so much about.
That's the one. They targeted about 20 specific spots in the genome loci that they believe, based on comparing ancient fragments and modern relatives, were linked to those classic direwolf traits.
Like what traits specifically?
Things like, well, larger body size, maybe a stronger jaw for crushing bone, adaptations for hypercarnivory, eating mostly meat, and being better suited for colder Ice Age climates.
So they're editing a gray wolf genome to add in features they think the dire wolf had?
Precisely. It's an educated guess, guided by the available fragmented data and comparisons.
Okay, so this isn't cloning then. Not like Dolly the sheep, where they took a cell and made an identical copy using SENT, somatic cell nuclear transfer.
No, exactly. And that's important because SENT in dogs, in canids, has a really poor track record. Studies show prenatal loss rates over 80%. It's just not efficient.
Wow, 80% loss? That's grim.
It is. So Colossal used a different approach. They created embryos with these CRISPR edits already made and then implanted those embryos into gray wolf surrogate mothers.
Okay, so edited embryos carried by regular gray wolves. It really is more like designer gray wolves with some inferred ancient traits sprinkled in.
That's a pretty accurate description, yeah. Functional proxies starts to make more sense now. It's designed to potentially act like a dire wolf in an ecosystem, but it's not, biologically speaking, Canis dirus.
Right, and you mentioned ecosystems. Even if they could make a perfect 100% replica, where would it live? The world has changed, hasn't it?
Dramatically. Habitat fragmentation is a huge, huge issue. A recent USGS assessment suggests only about 30% of the wolf's historical range in North America is still connected.
Only 30%.
Yeah. The rest is chopped up by roads, cities, farms, human development. So even a genetically perfect dire wolf clone would face a landscape it wasn't adapted for, with nowhere near the space it likely needed.
Okay, so layer 1 summary. What we have is a genetically modified gray wolf aiming to resemble a dire wolf. It's limited by how much ancient DNA actually survives and by the fact that the modern world is completely different.
That's the essence of it.
All right, let's move to layer 2. Moral intelligence. This gets sticky, doesn't it? Just because we develop the technology to do this kind of genetic tinkering, does that automatically mean it's the right thing to do? Is there an ethical green light?
That is absolutely the core ethical question, and there's no easy answer. The IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they basically say de-extinction is highly controversial. People support it or oppose it for a whole spectrum of reasons: biological, economic, political, ethical.
No consensus.
Not at all. It's a very mixed bag ethically.
Okay, well, one thing that immediately comes to mind is animal welfare. You mentioned the really high failure rate, over 80% loss with canid cloning using SCNT. Even if CRISPR is maybe more targeted, we're still talking about manipulating embryos, pregnancies, surrogate mothers. What's the potential cost in terms of animal suffering? And are companies like Colossal being transparent about this?
That's a critical point, the welfare debt, as some call it. Think about the cloned Bucardo, that Spanish ibex. They managed to de-extinct one, technically. It lived for about 7 minutes.
To the minutes.
Yeah, died from a lung defect. It highlights the potential suffering involved in these attempts. And to your point, Colossal hasn't released detailed public data on their own success rates, failure rates, or the welfare outcomes for the surrogates and the pups produced so far. That lack of transparency is ethically concerning for many.
Yeah, you'd want to know the cost in animal lives for each success.
Okay, another big ethical area feels like. Resources. Conservation funds are notoriously limited, right?
Extremely limited.
So is pouring money into high-tech de-extinction projects potentially pulling sons away from efforts to save species that are, endangered right now? That's the conservation triage, right, or moral hazard argument. Some researchers, like Bennett and colleagues, modeled this. Their work suggested that for every $1 million shifted from conventional conservation to de-extinction, you might actually risk the recovery plans for maybe 2 currently endangered species. Think about something like the Mexican wolf, which is critically endangered. Where does that $1 million do more good? Preventing a current extinction or trying to undo a past one? It's a tough calculation.
It really is a difficult trade-off. And what about the people who live where these proxies might eventually be released? You're talking about reintroducing a large predator, potentially bigger or perceived as more dangerous than a gray wolf?
Absolutely. This hits on justice and what you might call ecological consent. Putting a large predator back on the landscape has real impacts. Ranchers, for example, already deal with livestock losses from gray wolves. The USDA tracks this, and the cost can be significant.
Right, so introducing something potentially perceived as a super wolf?
Exactly. It amplifies those legitimate concerns. True ethical practice here demands more than just, hey, the science works. It requires genuine engagement and getting free, prior, and informed consent from the communities affected. That includes indigenous communities, who often have vital ecological knowledge and deep cultural connections to the land and wildlife, and whose perspectives on restoration might be very different.
And whose land rights and data sovereignty need to be respected too, I imagine.
Definitely. Plus, there's another wrinkle: genomic intellectual property. If these proxies are based on patented gene edits, Do they become corporate assets? Who owns this revived piece of nature? It gets complicated fast.
So layer 2 really forces us to check these ethical boxes. Is the animal welfare cost acceptable and transparent? Are the resource trade-offs being honestly assessed? Is there genuine community consent and equity?
Those are the crucial checkpoints, yeah.
Okay, let's shift into prediction now. Layer 3, systemic foresight. Let's imagine they get past the ethical hurdle somehow. They actually manage to successfully breed and release these proxies. What happens next? What are the potential ecological consequences? Let's play out a scenario. Say 500 dire wolf proxies released into Yellowstone around 2040. What might we see?
Okay, well, we need to think in terms of interacting effects, first, second, third order.
Dominoes falling.
Kind of. So first order effect, maybe something positive. These are large predators. They might help suppress elk populations, which are arguably overabundant in some areas.
And less elk browsing could mean
recovery of streamside vegetation like willows and aspen, which in turn could benefit beaver populations, maybe improve water quality, that classic trophic cascade effect. Potentially a good thing for ecosystem balance.
Okay, that sounds promising, but there's always a but, isn't there? What are the second order effects?
Well, these proxies are still very closely related to gray wolves. They could potentially outcompete existing gray wolf packs for territory and resources.
Hey, competition.
Or worse, they might hybridize with them, interbreed.
Ah, and that would.
That could really muddy the waters for gray wolf conservation. Think about the legal and genetic complexities we already face with red wolves and coyotes or gray wolves where hybridization occurs. It could undermine existing protections under things like the Endangered Species Act if the genetic lines become blurred. Who are we protecting then?
Right. Trying to add one piece back might mess up another existing piece. Okay, so that's competition and hybridization. What about third order effects, the bigger ripples?
Think about human reactions. If these proxies cause more conflict with livestock or are perceived as more dangerous,
You could get a significant public backlash.
exactly. Increased human-wildlife conflict often leads to political pressure. You can see intensified lobbying against predators in general, potentially leading to rollbacks in protections or cuts to funding for broader conservation efforts, even for the ESA itself. The social and political fallout could be substantial and detrimental to conservation overall.
And we haven't even touched on diseases or parasites yet.
That's another major systemic risk. It's called parasite spillback or pathogen spillover. Extinct animals often had their own unique suite of parasites and diseases.
Like Taniadirus, the dire wolf tapeworm, right? I saw that mentioned.
Precisely. Now, these gene-edited proxies wouldn't have co-evolved with those ancient pathogens. They might lack the specific immunities the original dire wolves had.
Meaning they could be highly susceptible.
Yes, or they could become reservoirs, incubators, potentially allowing ancient pathogens to reemerge or even evolve into new, virulent strains. And those could potentially jump to other wildlife or livestock.
Or even humans, a One Health nightmare scenario.
It's a potential risk that needs careful consideration from a One Health perspective, linking animal, human, and environmental health. You're introducing unknown biological variables.
It paints a picture of cascading consequences, way beyond just more wolves. There's that quote from conservation biologist Phil Seddon.
Short-term logic creates long-term collapse.
Yeah, it feels relevant here. Trying to fix one past problem might create a whole set of new, unpredictable future problems across the entire system.
That's the core challenge with intervening in complex systems, ecological or otherwise. The unintended consequences can easily outweigh the intended benefits.
Okay, let's pivot inward. Layer 4. Embodied insight. Why does this whole idea de-extinction, bringing back these iconic creatures, why does it grab us so powerfully? What's going on inside us?
Well, part of it is almost certainly biological wiring. Those viral photos of the pups we talked about,
Yeah.
they hit what neuroscientists call neoteny triggers. Big eyes, roundish faces. These are paedomorphic or baby-like features. They trigger an oxytocin release in our brains, the same bonding hormone involved in our connection with pets and human infants. It's a powerful, somewhat subconscious emotional pull.
So our brains are kind of hardwired to go, at the puppy pictures, which short-circuits critical thinking.
To some extent, yes. The marketing definitely leverages that biological response. It creates an immediate positive emotional connection.
Beyond the cute factor, though, there seems to be something deeper.
I think so. Dolly Jurgensen, a historian who studies environmental issues, has made a really insightful argument. She suggests that for some, the enthusiasm for de-extinction might represent a kind of bargaining phase in the 5 stages of ecological mourning.
bargaining. Like, if we can just bring this one species back, maybe the larger extinction crisis isn't so final, so devastating.
Exactly. We're living through the sixth mass extinction, grieving this immense loss of biodiversity. The idea that we could use technology to undo an extinction offers a powerful sense of hope, a way to cope with that grief and perhaps alleviate some collective guilt. It's like seeking techno-absolution.
Techno-absolution, I like that term. Like, technology can wash away our environmental sins. Stuart Brand, the whole Earth catalog guy who's involved in de-extinction, talked about this stunning realization that extinction might be reversible.
Right, Jurgensen quotes him. That sense of, wow, we can fix this, is incredibly appealing. It taps into a very human desire for control and redemption.
But does that emotional appeal maybe blind us to the risks?
It certainly can skew our perception. There's research, for example, by Cass Sunstein, showing how we tend to evaluate risks differently depending on how they're framed. A potential biohazard framed as exciting innovation, like de-extinction, might be perceived as less risky than the exact same potential hazard if it's labeled, say, a GMO threat.
Our emotional response hijacks the rational risk assessment based on the label.
Pretty much. And let's not forget the status element, funding or leading a high-profile de-extinction project. It can be a powerful form of status signaling in certain circles. Technological prowess, saving the planet. It ticks a lot of boxes.
So layer 4 suggests our fascination isn't just scientific curiosity. It's tangled up with our biology, our grief, our hopes, our biases, maybe even our egos. We need to be wary of spectacle-driven science.
Well put. Understanding these internal drivers is key to evaluating the projects more objectively.
Okay, let's bring it back to the ground. Layer 5, human-centered design. Even if the science works and the ethics seem manageable, how will actual people behave when faced with these proxies in their world?
This is critical. There's often a gap between people liking an idea in theory and accepting its reality on the ground. Call it the adoption deli.
Yeah, I like wolves, just not my sheep being eaten by wolves.
Exactly. Behavioral economics and anthropology give us insights here. Surveys might show high initial public approval for bringing back the dire wolf. Sounds cool, but that support can plummet. As one study by Fletcher showed, once you start talking about concrete costs or potential negative impacts, like maybe higher insurance premiums for livestock owners or restrictions on land use.
The reality check bites, and different groups will react differently, right?
Absolutely. You've got tourists who might be thrilled at the chance to see one. Ranters who see a direct threat to their livelihood. Remember the USDA data on current wolf losses. Urban voters who might support it ideologically, but worry about safety if proxies roam near populated areas. And crucially, indigenous communities who have their own long-standing relationships with wolves and the land and need genuine agency in any decision-making process, not just consultation after the fact.
So releasing the animals is maybe the easy part. Designing the human system around them is the real challenge.
Precisely. It's not just an ecological project, it's a socio-ecological one. Success depends on designing for people. This means things like co-designing benefit-sharing mechanisms. Look at Colorado's compensation fund for wolf depredation. Something similar would be needed. Maybe royalties from related ecotourism channeled back to local communities, or clear, fair compensation systems linked to verified impacts.
Transparency, too, presumably.
Essential. Public dashboards showing monitoring data, impact assessments, and genuine co-management structures, especially with indigenous groups, respecting their knowledge and rights. Without this kind of careful friction design to manage the social aspects,
You risked just replaying the same old gray wolf culture wars, but maybe with higher stakes because the animal is even more hyped.
that's the danger. Social license isn't just a nice to have, it's fundamental for any kind of long-term success or acceptance.
All right, moving towards the end game. Layer 6, risk and resilience. What if we're wrong? What are the big failure points? And how do we build in safeguards?
This layer is about embracing humility, really. Assume failure is possible, even likely in some aspects, and plan for it. Design for failure.
Okay, so what are the key risks that keep coming up?
Based on the sources, a few stand out. First, genomic off-targets. CRISPR is precise, but not perfect. You could get unintended edits elsewhere in the genome.
Causing what?
Unpredictable health issues for the proxies, developmental problems, weird diseases, higher cancer rates, muscle disorders, things we can't foresee.
Mitigation for that.
Rigorous screening before release. Deep dives into their genome, transcriptome, proteome, multi-omics. And maybe building in genetic safeguards, like inducible sterilization genes, sometimes called a daisy chain drive, as a potential fallback if things go really sideways.
Okay, unintended genetic consequences. What else?
Pathogen spillover or parasite release. We touched on this. The risk of reactivating dormant ancient pathogens, or these proxies becoming susceptible to new ones, or their unique parasites like Taenia diarrhea spreading unpredictably.
How do you mitigate that?
Strict quarantine protocols are obvious, but also deep metagenomic screening of the animals and their environment before scaling up any release. Don't just check for known pathogens, look for anything unexpected. And you'd need protocols specifically for how to handle or even restore associated parasites safely if that's deemed necessary ecologically.
Right. Don't want to accidentally unleash tiny tapeworm apocalypse?
No, definitely not. And the third big one is socioeconomic and legal backlash.
The human dimension biting back again.
Yeah. Increased conflict leads to lawsuits, political fights. Anti-wolf or anti-predator lobbies could potentially seize on any negative incident involving these proxies to try to weaken broader wildlife laws, like the Endangered Species Act.
So how do you build resilience against that?
Pre-agreed conditions for pausing or stopping the project sunset clauses linked to clear metrics. Independent audits of social acceptance, not just internal PR. And having dedicated escrow funds ready beforehand to handle compensation claims fairly and quickly. Don't wait for the crisis.
It reminds me of Carl Sagan. Extinction is the rule. Survival is the exception.
Exactly. Technology doesn't magically make us immune to failure or unintended consequences. Real resilience means planning for things to go wrong, using concepts like anti-fragility, maybe Bayesian scenario, planning to constantly update risk assessments as new data comes in.
Okay, final layer. Layer 7, execution engine. If, after all that, the decision is made to proceed, how do you actually do it responsibly? How do you test, learn, and decide in a way that isn't just hype?
This is where you get ruthlessly practical. It's all about minimum viable experiments or MVPs, minimum viable populations maybe, and phased rollouts with clear decision points. No giant leaps of faith.
Break it down. What might a phased roadmap look like based on the thinking?
Okay, phase 1 could be the genome stage, years 0 to 2 maybe. The absolute focus is minimizing those off-target edits. Set a strict key performance indicator, like, say, less than 0.01% off-target mutation rate. If you can't hit that basic genetic fidelity...
Still gate, stop there.
Exactly. Archive the data, publish, but don't proceed. If you pass, phase 2. Captive cohort, years 2 to 6 perhaps.
Yeah.
Breed and control group, say 30 proxies. Keep them in a large, secure, monitored enclosure, maybe 50 hectares or something. Track everything. GPS movements, survival rates.
KPIs here.
High survival, obviously, maybe benchmark at 85%. Document what they actually eat, prey preference. Continuous, rigorous pathogen screening. If you see high mortality, unexpected disease, major welfare issues, another kill gate.
Okay, prove they can thrive in a controlled setting without being disease vectors. Next.
Phase 3. Semi-wild nursery, or maybe a phase 1 field trial. Years 6 to 12, potentially. Take a small group, maybe 10 individuals, perhaps sterilized initially to prevent uncontrolled breeding, and release them into a more natural but still contained environment. Think a large fenced reserve or maybe an island, like in the Yukon example, sometimes discussed for de-extinction trials. 2, ecological function. Do they actually hunt the target prey, like elk? Does their presence have the predicted effect, like reducing browsing pressure? KPIs would be things like stable prey preference, matching predictions, still no novel pathogens detected, and some measurable positive ecological impact. If they fail to perform ecologically or new problems emerge, kill gate again.
Demonstrate ecological function safely in a contained wild setting. And then comes the big decision.
Right. Only after successfully navigating those phases do you reach a major decision gate, maybe around year 10 or 15. Use all the data collected. Genetic, health, behavioral, ecological, social feedback. Feed it into an adaptive model, maybe a Bayesian one that updates with new info. And the decision to proceed with any wider, non-contained rollout is contingent on meeting incredibly strict, pre-agreed metrics. Things like a calculated net ecosystem benefit score of 1.0 or higher, meaning clear evidence it's doing more good than harm ecologically. And D, critically, human-wildlife conflict incidents involving the proxies must remain below a very low baseline, perhaps set relative to existing gray wolf conflict rates, like maybe only 5% of that baseline.
And if those aren't met?
Project halts. Archive the genetic material, publish all the data, especially the negative results, open access for transparency, and stop the rollout. If it does meet the criteria, then any further scaling has to be incremental, adaptive, and always require explicit community opt-in and ongoing monitoring.
So layer 7 is all about MVPs or GTFO, Rigorous, measurable pilot projects, clear kill switches, data over dreams, iteration, and letting the evidence drive the decisions, not the press releases.
That's the ideal, yes. Prioritize learning and safety over speed and spectacle.
Wow, okay. So we started with this exciting headline, dire wolves are back, but running it through the thinking stack.
Yeah.
Well, it pulls back the curtain, doesn't it? What we actually have is this incredibly complex situation layered with genetic realities, really thorny ethical questions, huge ecological unknowns, and our own very human baggage, our hopes, fears, biases.
It's far from a simple yes-no proposition.
Right. The question really shifts from just can we do this to should we? And even if we think we should, how do we do it without causing more harm than good? Is this tech truly aimed at healing the planet, or is it maybe more about satisfying a human need to fix things, or even, dare I say, a bit of human ego?
And that question of opportunity cost hangs heavy, doesn't it? When you think about the finite resources, money, time, expertise, could they be better spent preventing the extinctions that are happening right now, conserving the species we still have a chance to save? It's a brutal comparison sometimes.
Yeah. So the takeaway feels like when you encounter these big flashy stories about techno fixes for nature, it's worth engaging the whole thinking stack. Look past the headline. Ask about the real science, the ethics, the potential ripple effects, the human motivations.
And maybe, just maybe, balance the excitement about bringing back the dead with support for keeping the living alive, supporting the less glamorous on-the-ground conservation work that's happening every day.
Because the future really is a feedback loop. The choices we make now, especially with powerful technologies like this, they echo. They create the world we and every other species will inhabit tomorrow.
Indeed.
Stay curious.
Stay critical.
Keep